Let's discuss the first encounters between Native Americans and Europeans. These can be characterized as ambiguous performance. Performance in that they often involve singing, they involve dancing, they involve speeches. This is theater with a purpose. It's ambiguous, though. It is confusing to both sides for obvious reasons. Obviously, language is a problem. Translators could not always be found, and both sides speak different languages. But also, it is confusing, it is ambiguous because of the symbols and the actions taken by both sides were confusing as neither side had any shared context. That cross that Columbus and other Europeans often carried had no significance, had no meaning to these Native American tribes. Also, power levels are ambiguous at first. These Native Americans have no idea of the power, economic and military, that is backing Columbus. They have no idea that he represents the recently unified nation state of Spain. Just as Columbus has no idea if these Native Americans represent a tribe of 20 people or a tribe of 2,000 people. Oftentimes, when Europeans and Native Americans first came together, the Native Americans were often on top in terms of power. They knew the area, they knew the land, and they might have even had more people. But over time, as a result of disease especially, Europeans will emerge as more powerful. The best example of this ambiguous performance can be found in Cortez and Montezuma, the leader of the Aztecs. When Cortez arrived, he demanded native submission. At the same time, Montezuma tried to impress Cortez and the conquistadors with displays of gold and a massive parade and offers of anything that the Spanish might want. Now, some historians have suspected that Cortez may have been perceived as a god, or at least sent by a Aztec god. But at the same time, Montezuma was trying to use Cortez and the Spanish to maintain his power over the subjugated tribes of central Mexico. He's trying to manipulate Cortez. He's trying to make him a tool for his reign. As a result of this ambiguity, there are misperceptions on both sides. And one common European misperception is that the Native Americans were weak. In fact, they were oftentimes quite strong. They may have been weakened by disease. Remember, disease works both ways in the New World, but it is way worse for Native Americans. And this disease often led to the disunity that Europeans saw. It led to civil disorder as leaders maybe died disproportionately from that disease. It led to rebellion. It led to tribal warfare. So Native Americans were not as weak as Europeans may have initially perceived them to be. Ponce de Leon, in fact, met Florida Native Americans who refused to trade with him and even drove him off with military force. Later, upon another landing in another part of Florida, he was approached by Native Americans, possibly to trade, and then battle broke out. And Ponce de Leon, in fact, died from wounds suffered at this second landing. Another conquistador, De Soto, the first European to probably see the Mississippi River. When he met the Chickasaw people, he demanded porters, he demanded servants be provided by this tribe. They responded by attacking, and De Soto suffered heavy losses. Another common misperception is that Native American tribes or bands were only small groups of people over small areas of land. And while that was true in some areas, there were powerful and complex and large Native American nations and empires in the New World. For example, Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital in central Mexico, where modern-day Mexico City lies, was likely the largest city in the world in 1492. It was at least in the top 5. Those bridges you see stretching out of the city were said to be able to hold 10 horses across. There are canals in between all the districts for transportation. There was a market that could service up to 40,000 people. There are at least 45 public buildings. And Montezuma's palace had over 100 rooms, each with a bath, for those conquered nobles that he brought to live with him in Tenochtitlan. This is very similar to what Louis XIV did at Versailles. There's even a city planner to make sure the city stays organized, and a zoo with 300 staff members, and a fresh and saltwater aquarium in Tenochtitlan. And it wasn't just in Mexico. The Powhatan Confederacy of modern-day Virginia and North Carolina, the people who will encounter the Jamestown settlers. The Powhatan Confederacy wasn't one tribe, it was actually multiple tribes, stretching over 100 villages, and they had a complex system of government with representatives and with taxes. And the Incan Empire in South America was possibly the largest empire in the world in the early 1500s before it was toppled by the Spanish. Another misperception, this time on the Native American side, was that Europeans may not be that bad, that Europeans may be able to be used, like Montezuma was trying to do, to improve their situation. For example, with Cortez, there were some Indians in central Mexico who had been ruled by the Aztecs, who had been conquered by the Aztecs, who allied with Cortez to try to overthrow, to defeat the Aztecs. And they were successful in defeating the Aztecs, but over the long run, this ended up being worse for those Indian allies. Coronado, who traveled through the American Southwest, had as many as 2,000 Indian allies on his journey. And his records make separate distinction between these Indian allies and the Indian slaves they took with them as well. And with the Incans, the Spanish used military might but also played on the palace intrigue of Incan nobles. This looked a lot more like a Game of Thrones episode without the dragons than entirely military conquest. They played on the goals and desires and infighting between Incan nobles to conquer and topple the Incan Empire. Some Incan nobles thought in the long run they could use the Spanish to gain power for themselves, but in actuality, this ended up being way worse for the Incan people.